In the harsh winter of 1558, the echoing whispers within the stone walls of St. James's Palace foretold not only an approaching death, but the extinction of a dynasty. Mary Tudor, the once proud daughter of Henry VIII and Queen of England, had become a shadow of herself. The face that once radiated royal grace was now sallow, her body grotesquely swollen, her skin resembling that of a corpse already beginning to decay. The woman known to history as Bloody Mary was dying at 42, not in the fire of her faith, but in the slow agony of a disease that was consuming her flesh. Even those who had cursed her name for years could not entirely suppress a feeling of pity mixed with horror at the sight of her final days. But the stench of rotting flesh and pus was only the final act of this tragedy. What truly unfolded was the dramatic collapse of a woman repeatedly betrayed by fate, forced to battle both her own body and her unrelenting faith. The death of Mary Tudor was not merely the final breath of a monarch, it was the embodiment of the price of fanaticism, repression, and long-suppressed fury made flesh, viewed through the cold lens of modern medicine. Mary's final months paint a horrifying picture, likely suffering from uterine or liver cancer. Her body was decaying from within, turning every breath into torment. Her abdomen had grotesquely swollen, her skin had taken on a sickly, deathly glow from jaundice. Witnesses recorded her screams echoing through the palace corridors at night, sometimes pleading with God, sometimes cursing her own shadow. The woman who had once burned Protestants alive was now burning within her own body. This was no dignified royal death. It was a portrait of decay that stripped away every illusion of human grandeur. Mary Tudor's story reminds us that before death, even the crown is powerless. Kings, queens, even those who believe themselves chosen by God, must all face the same mortal frailty in the end. And yet, Mary's life had begun in hope. Born in 1516, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, she was destined to inherit England's throne. Her childhood unfolded amid glittering courtly ceremonies and the finest education Europe could offer. In her father's eyes, she was the perfect princess, the pride of the kingdom. But the brilliance of that royal fairy tale soon curdled into nightmare. Henry's obsession with Anne Boleyn drove him to annul his marriage and declare Mary illegitimate. In a single stroke, the heir to England's throne lost both her title and her identity. The king's new favorite, the infant Elizabeth, took her place. Mary was stripped not only of her status but of her very sense of self. No longer a princess, but a servant to her half-sister. It was more than political punishment, it was psychological execution. Her mother, Catherine, was exiled to a distant castle, where she slowly wasted away, many believed by poison. Mary was forbidden even a final visit. She lived under constant surveillance, harassed by her father's agents, and reminded daily that the slightest act of defiance could mean death. Once celebrated as the Pearl of England, she became a silent, withdrawn figure living in the shadows of her former life. The scars of that trauma cut deep, both in mind and body. She began to suffer chronic illness, irregular menstruation, crippling headaches, stomach cramps, and bouts of melancholy that today would be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress. But in her age, such symptoms were dismissed as mere female weakness. Faith became her only refuge. She rejected the Protestant order her father had created and clung with desperate devotion to Catholicism. When Henry severed England from Rome, Mary experienced it as a personal betrayal. She continued to practice the old rites in secret, whispering her prayers in defiance. This unyielding faith would later evolve into the religious fanaticism that consumed hundreds of Protestant lives in flame. By the time her father restored her as his heir in 1544, nothing remained of the hopeful princess she had once been. Mary had become a woman poised on the edge between faith and madness. Life had taught her that power and cruelty were inseparable, and when she finally ascended the throne, she would carve that lesson into England in blood. The confident princess who had once been her father's favorite was gone, replaced by a broken, suspicious woman. The humiliation Mary Tudor endured in her youth, being declared illegitimate, seeing her mother die in exile, and losing her rightful claim to the throne, had carved an irreparable wound into her soul. That wound never healed. Instead, it shaped her faith, poisoned her judgment, and eventually turned into an obsession that would drown a nation in blood. When Mary ascended the throne in 1553, following the brief 9-day reign of Lady Jane Grey, she was no longer merely a queen. She was a woman who believed herself chosen by God, walking a narrow line between faith and madness. At 37, Considered old for a woman in her era, she clung to a single hope: to bear an heir who would return England to Catholicism. That desire became an obsession that slowly consumed both her body and her mind. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain was a cold political alliance from the start. Philip, 11 years her junior, saw Mary not as a wife, but as a tool to advance Habsburg interests. Even the wedding lacked joy. Contemporaries described it as more like a funeral than a celebration. Mary, desperate for affection, sought to earn Philip's love with a kind of pathetic fervor that only deepened his disgust. A few months after their marriage, rumors began spreading through the court. The Queen was pregnant. Mary's abdomen swelled noticeably. She complained of morning sickness, and even claimed to feel the movements of the child within her. Physicians, too afraid to contradict their sovereign, confirmed the pregnancy. Cradles were prepared, wet nurses chosen, and the palace readied itself for the birth of a Catholic heir. But months passed, and no labor came. Mary's body grew larger as her hope withered. Each day she prayed to God for a sign, but heaven remained silent. Modern medicine would diagnose her condition as pseudocyesis, a phantom pregnancy, likely caused by ovarian or uterine tumors producing the physical symptoms of gestation. Yet the real devastation occurred in her spirit. Where a child should have been, there was only emptiness, a void that twisted her faith into paranoia. She became convinced that God was punishing her for England's sins. Philip, meanwhile, remained coldly indifferent. Once he realized Mary would bear him no heir, he saw the marriage as politically worthless and returned to Spain. The Queen was left alone, praying endlessly, waiting for divine reassurance that never came. Each silence from God drove her further toward despair and madness. By 1557, when she announced her second pregnancy, everyone at court knew it was only a repetition of the same tragic delusion. Even her own doctors whispered doubts among themselves, though none dared to speak the truth. Mary insisted that God was testing her faith once more. When no child came, she proclaimed that England's sins had again blocked divine grace. God has given me not a womb, but a sword, she is said to have declared, and she turned that sword upon the Protestants. Thus began one of the darkest chapters in English history. The Marian persecutions, which started in 1555, were not merely political repression but the state-sponsored eruption of a woman's spiritual collapse. Mary saw those who rejected Catholicism as souls diseased, and she resolved to cleanse them with fire. The first victim was Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had annulled her father's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Mary longed for vengeance for her mother's humiliation. She forced Cranmer to watch as his fellow reformers were burned alive before his own execution. Yet at the stake, when Cranmer thrust his hand into the flames, crying, "This hand offended my mother first, let it burn first," Mary reportedly smiled, one of the few moments in her life when she showed any sign of satisfaction. For 3 years, more than 280 men, women, and even children were burned at the stake. These executions became ritual spectacles, almost religious ceremonies. Mary personally reviewed many of the cases, granting heretics the chance to repent, not out of mercy, but from a twisted conviction that salvation could only be achieved through suffering. What made her cruelty even more terrifying was her belief that she was doing God's work. In letters to her bishops, she wrote that the darkness in heretics' hearts must be cleansed by flame, calling the burnings a divine treatment for England's spiritual disease. For Mary Tudor, fire was no longer punishment, it was purification, but the flames that devoured her victims would, in the end, consume her own soul as well. Faith had given way to madness, and that madness left a scar on England that would never fade. On the road to her death, Mary Tudor was no longer merely a monarch, she had become a victim, burning in the fire of her own faith. In her mind, England remained a sinful nation, stricken by divine wrath. She believed herself chosen by God to purge that sin through flame. Every heretic who burned, she thought, cleansed not only their own soul, but the soul of the entire kingdom. To Mary, this blood-soaked purification was divine approval, and that conviction gave her the strength to stand coldly before the listening to human screams as though they were prayers. Witnesses described how the Queen watched the executions, almost like religious ceremonies. As the flames rose, a look of rapture came over her face. Amidst the victims' cries, she lifted her head toward heaven in prayer. To those who saw her, the fire was England's baptismal water. Yet this state of fanatic ecstasy could not conceal The rapid disintegration of her body and mind. Court accounts from 1557 onwards speak of a queen growing increasingly unstable. She reacted to the smallest bad news with violent rage, accusing those around her of heresy. When reports arrived that the burnings were strengthening Protestant resistance rather than suppressing it, she suffered fits, shouting, "The devil's seed still lives among us." Her trust was gone. She suspected even her most loyal advisors of betrayal, refused food, and fasted for days, fearing that her meals were poisoned. Mary's mental state horrified even Europe's Catholic courts. Kings who shared her faith trembled at her name, and even the Pope, in private letters, urged moderation. But she ignored them all. She believed that nothing was too extreme in the sacred mission of reclaiming England for God. Even her husband, Philip II, grew ashamed to be seen beside her. The Queen's decaying body and her thirst for blood had become an embarrassment to the Spanish crown. The greatest tragedy, however, was that Mary destroyed her own cause. In trying to make England Catholic again, she transformed Protestantism into the symbol of courage and faith. The burned reformers became heroes in the eyes of the people. Their bravery outshone her fire. To the common mind, Catholicism had become the religion of cruelty, and Protestantism the faith of freedom. Mary's flames did not purify faith. They scorched the nation's heart. By the end of 1557, her physical decay could no longer be hidden. Courtiers wrote of how the once elegant and stately queen had become swollen, yellowed, and deformed. Her skin was jaundiced, her eyes sunken, her stomach grotesquely distended, no longer the swelling of pregnancy, but of death. Modern medicine suggests that Mary suffered from terminal uterine or ovarian cancer, compounded by liver failure. In her own time, no such diagnosis existed. Her doctors treated her with torturous medieval methods. They bled her, purged her with emetics, and weakened her further with curative herbs. The Queen suffered both from disease and from the agony of its so-called treatments. Her pain was so intense that her groans echoed through the palace corridors at night, demoralizing the guards. Servants feared entering her chambers. The stench of decay was unbearable, forcing them to work in shifts. Her skin peeled. Her gowns were stained with pus. Some witnesses claimed she began to rot before she died. But the most terrifying decay was within her mind. The unending pain, the knowledge that her body was collapsing, and the horror of feeling herself rot drove her to the brink of madness. She became convinced that her illness was caused by Protestant witchcraft or secret assassins. "God is not punishing me," she reportedly said. "He is cleansing me through decay." To her, even death had become a form of penance. In her final months, her agony surpassed the limits of human endurance. She could no longer sleep, breathe easily, or find comfort in any position. Every breath reminded her of the rot inside her. Every moment was a new torment. Those few who dared to look upon her wrote that she was no longer a woman, but a corpse marked by God's curse. Mary Tudor's death was not merely the end of a ruler, it was the collapse of a faith turned inward upon itself. Her body became the vessel of a soul seeking salvation through fire, only to find its own hell within. It is said that, as she died, she whispered prayers dedicating England to God, but her prayers no longer inspired hope, only dread. In the end, Mary Tudor did not perish in the flames she so loved. She vanished into the darkness they left behind. Mary Tudor's final days were not the decline of a queen. They were the collapse of a human being who had become the embodiment of divine punishment. Her illness no longer consumed just her organs, but every cell, every fragment of flesh. Her hands and feet had blackened. Dark stains spread along her veins. Her nails thickened and tore away from the flesh beneath, leaving unhealed, pus-filled wounds that sent waves of pain through her body with every movement. Servants trembled when touching her hands, pressing handkerchiefs to their noses to endure the stench of rotting flesh. The change in her face was the most dreadful sign of decay. The once graceful features that had reminded courtiers of her father, Henry VIII, now bore only the shadow of death. Her cheeks were sunken, the skin stretched thin across bone. Her lips turned black, cracking and bleeding when she tried to speak. Her eyes held no light, no will, only the frozen reflection of suffering. Those who saw her crossed themselves instinctively, whispering, "She is no longer a queen, but a warning." Mary could no longer sleep. Every breath was pain. Every movement, agony. She spent her days upright in a specially built chair, unable to lie down for fear that the pooling of fluids in her ravaged body would suffocate her. Her royal chamber had ceased to resemble a palace room. It had become a death ward. Thick incense smoke, the stench of decay that no perfume could hide. Herbs and rags piled in every corner. Servants moved silently, cleaning the stains on the floor before fleeing as quickly as they could. This physical corruption echoed within her soul. Mary began to see herself as Job, a servant of God under divine trial. She believed her agony was a holy purification and that her pain would earn her salvation. She demanded daily masses, commanded her priests to pray constantly, and believed that the presence of the Holy Eucharist could somehow halt the decay of her flesh. But no miracle came. It was only her body that rotted, not her faith. Her ability to govern had vanished completely, yet she still saw herself as God's chosen ruler. From her death chair she dictated decrees, signed death warrants, and insisted that heresy be punished without mercy. Diplomats and ministers who entered her presence found not a sovereign, but a living corpse attempting to rule from the grave. The machinery of government had all but stopped. No one dared approach her chamber anymore. Her will to live was as frightening as her suffering. She felt death in every breath, but refused to yield to it. This defiance inspired both awe and dread among those around her. Mary could not accept that her dream of a Catholic England would die with her. Her voice had faded to a rasp, her hands too weak to hold a pen, yet she continued to believe she was fulfilling God's mission. By November 1558, the palace had become steeped in silence and the smell of decay. Servants had to steel themselves before entering her room, and many vomited upon leaving it. The body that had once commanded a kingdom now lay imprisoned in its own filth. Her bowels and bladder had failed completely. No amount of incense or perfume could conceal the stench. Her mind wavered between religious ecstasy and madness. At times, she claimed to see the Virgin Mary promising her heaven. At others, she screamed that demons were dragging her to hell. During these fits, even her priests feared to approach her. "The fire of God burns in her eyes," one whispered. The physicians knew there was no hope left. Still, they continued to spread the lie that the Queen is improving, desperate to maintain political calm while secretly preparing for Elizabeth's succession. Behind the scenes, plans were laid to ensure a peaceful transfer of power and to avoid civil war. Meanwhile, far away in Spain, Philip II awaited news with cold detachment. When informed that his wife was dying, he did not return to England. Instead, he sent brief, emotionless letters. "God forgive you, Mary." History's irony was merciless. The woman who had shown no pity now found none. She had burned hundreds for the salvation of their souls, but now she herself was being consumed by a slow, merciless decay with no hope of redemption. By mid, all who entered the palace knew her death was near, yet she clung to life as though trying to finish one last prayer, one last act of repentance. But even her defiance began to fade. Her organs failed one by one, her body dissolving a little more each day. There was no fire left to cling to, not of faith, not of power. Mary Tudor's end was the echo of the bodies she had burned, slow, searing, and silent as Mary Tudor writhed in agony within her decaying body. The New England that would rise after her was already taking shape. In the cold chambers of St. James's Palace, even before death claimed her, the next ruler was all but certain. The same half-sister Mary had once forced to serve her as a lady-in-waiting, Elizabeth. The kingdom lay shattered after 3 years of religious persecution, executions, and economic collapse. Yet Elizabeth's impending accession inspired a fragile sense of hope. Too many contemporaries, the fact that Mary's death would restore Protestant order seemed like a cruel twist of fate, or divine justice itself. The Protestant exiles who had fled Mary's fires began their journey home even before her death was announced. These men and women, hardened by years of exile in Geneva, Frankfurt, and Strasbourg, returned with a more disciplined and militant Protestantism. Their writings, especially John Fox's accounts of the Marian martyrs, would immortalize Mary's name in blood and flame. English Protestant identity itself was born from resistance to her tyranny. Mary's Catholic policies had not only brought spiritual repression but economic ruin. Craftsmen, merchants, and scholars branded as heretics had been executed, exiled, or stripped of their property. The productive classes were destroyed, trade networks collapsed, and the royal treasury emptied. Mary left behind not divine favor, but the wreckage of her own misguided faith. Neither Catholic Europe trusted her nor Protestant nations respected her England. Militarily, her reign ended in humiliation. France's recapture of Calais, England's last foothold on the continent, marked more than a territorial loss. It symbolized the end of centuries of English ambition in Europe. On her deathbed, she reportedly said, "When I die, Calais will be found engraved upon my heart." The defeat shattered national pride and pushed England into years of inward isolation. But Mary's most enduring legacy was not political or territorial, it was human. The people who burned at her stakes, yet forgave their executioners, became the foundation of a new faith. Their courage transformed horror into hope. Mary had sought to glorify Catholicism, yet in doing so ensured that it would forever be remembered in England as the creed of cruelty. Her flames did not purify faith, they burned away the possibility of reconciliation diplomatically. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain had reduced England to a Spanish satellite. To serve her husband's wars, she sacrificed her nation's independence. Relations with Protestant princes in Germany and with the Nordic kingdoms collapsed, while even Catholic allies grew wary of her fanaticism. By the final years of her reign, the Catholic restoration she had labored to build was already crumbling. Most of the bishops she appointed were foreigners, strangers to English hearts. The monasteries she reopened lacked wealth and public support. When she died, these fragile institutions dissolved overnight. Perhaps the greatest tragedy was that even her closest allies had abandoned her long before she died. The nobles who once championed her Catholic revival had come to see only ruin in her excesses. While Mary still prayed for divine mercy, her counselors quietly prepared Elizabeth's succession. Outwardly loyal, they were already servants of the coming age. On the morning of November 17, 1558, St. James's Palace no longer resembled a royal residence, but a chamber of death. The woman who had tried to cleanse her realm with fire now burned from within. The stench from her room clung to the very stones, seeping into the corridors. Her final spasms convulsed her wasted body. The guttural, half-human sounds that escaped her lips silenced even the priests reciting prayers. Her eyes grew pale, her gaze empty, as if her soul had already departed. At dawn, without ceremony or grandeur, amid a moment of heavy silence, Mary Tudor drew her last breath. No prayer, no farewell, only the quiet death of a woman who had spent her life listening to the screams of others. With Mary's passing, not only a queen, but an entire age of faith, cruelty, and contradiction was laid to rest. Behind her she left burning squares, an empty treasury, a broken nation, and a name that would echo through history: Bloody Mary. When Mary's servants began preparing her body for burial, they realized that the decay consuming their queen had surpassed anything the human mind could imagine. Some parts of her skin appeared mummified even before death, while others had decomposed with unnatural speed. The stench that emanated from her corpse made normal funeral preparations impossible. The palace had to be aired out for days. Her personal belongings were burned because the smell of death had seeped into every fabric, carpet, and even the stone walls themselves. Everything in Mary's chambers seemed tainted, marked by the weight of having witnessed her end. A primitive post-mortem examination, conducted according to the limited medical knowledge of the time, horrified even the most experienced physicians. Mary's internal organs were almost entirely decomposed, her abdomen filled with tumors. The official record diplomatically listed the cause of death as natural causes, but in truth, it was one of the most grotesque examples of the human body collapsing from within. Even her heart, removed according to royal burial custom, showed signs of partial decay, as if, like her faith and her passion, it too had consumed itself from the inside out. Mary Tudor's funeral, held at Westminster Abbey on December 14, 1558, was far from the grand farewell of a monarch. It was a subdued, almost reluctant ceremony, attended by courtiers who were there out of duty, not devotion. The Queen, who had dreamed of being remembered as the savior of Catholic England, was buried not with reverence, but with weary formality. With her death, change came almost instantly. Elizabeth ascended the throne and immediately halted all religious persecutions. Protestant exiles began returning home, and within weeks the entire Catholic order Mary had spent years constructing disintegrated. The nation seemed to erase her reign from memory and move forward as though she had never ruled. Across Europe, the reaction was equally striking. Protestant rulers celebrated her death with open relief. Even Catholic monarchs greeted the news without sorrow. The most telling response came from her husband, Philip II. He neither mourned nor defended her legacy. Instead, he quickly turned to re-establishing diplomatic relations with Elizabeth. The Catholic crusade Mary lived and died for was politically dead within a day of her passing. The economic revival that followed underscored how destructive her policies had been. Protestant craftsmen and merchants who had fled persecution returned with skills and capital, restoring trade and industry. Cities began to recover. In mere months, Elizabeth began to rebuild what Mary had shattered in 5 years. With her burial, the dream of a Catholic England was buried as well. Mary's reign had made mercy impossible to associate with Catholicism. The Protestants who had perished in her flames became the true saints of the English conscience. Her decaying body became a symbol of divine retribution, the punishment of a queen who had mistaken cruelty for faith. Before her body had even grown cold, her reputation was gone. Protestant writers portrayed her as the puppet of foreign powers. The name Bloody Mary spread across Europe, synonymous with terror and fanaticism. In English identity, she became the eternal warning against tyranny dressed in piety. Her illness also drew interest from later physicians. The symptoms preserved in royal records would, centuries later, provide valuable clues about cancer and its progression. Yet in her own time, Mary's death was interpreted not medically, but morally, as divine judgment upon a queen consumed by her own holy fire. Protestant preachers preached her agony as God's vengeance, while Catholic writers struggled to justify why a faithful servant of the Church met such a monstrous end. Her death became both a theological riddle and a moral lesson, a moment where religion, medicine, and mortality collided. In the end, Mary Tudor's story stands as the tragic embodiment of a woman consumed by the flames of her own conviction. In trying to resurrect Catholic England, she destroyed both her body and her soul. Her name became not a royal title, but a warning, a bloody reminder of what happens when power, faith, and cruelty become one. Yet even historians who try to approach Mary's reign with sympathy have found it nearly impossible to redeem her legacy from the wreckage of pain, fear, and failure she left behind. The administrative or financial reforms enacted during her rule have faded into obscurity, forgotten beneath the weight of the screams of those burned at the stake and the grotesque spectacle of the Queen's own dying body. Through her blind devotion to faith, Mary Tudor had not only consumed her flesh but also incinerated her memory. The medical enigma of her death continues to fascinate scholars and physicians even centuries later. Drawing on the detailed accounts of contemporaries, modern researchers have proposed various diagnoses. Most agree that she suffered from advanced uterine or ovarian cancer, likely compounded by liver failure. Yet, whatever the precise nature of her illness, one fact is undeniable. Mary endured one of the most horrific deaths in royal history, trapped for weeks, even months, inside a body that was rotting while she still lived, a prisoner of agony that stripped her of even the dignity of being human. Mary's story is not only a political tragedy, but also a psychological study, the tale of a girl who, having witnessed her mother's downfall and her own humiliation, sought to erase her trauma by wielding divine wrath with her own hands. The shame of being cast out by her father as an illegitimate daughter became, years later, the source of her mercilessness as queen. Her desire to restore the faith that had once sustained her was, in truth, an attempt to reclaim her lost identity. But this inner effort at healing turned outward into blood, fire, and destruction. And yet, her story endures as a powerful lesson in the futility of forced faith. Despite wielding all the machinery of the state, she failed to return England to Catholicism. Instead, she transformed Catholicism itself, in the eyes of her people, into a religion of cruelty. Her reign proved that belief cannot be decreed by edict, nor devotion imposed by fear. In the final days of her life, as her body decayed before her eyes, that physical disintegration became the ultimate symbol of power's impermanence and humanity's helplessness in the face of death. The woman, who once held absolute dominion over thousands of lives, ended her days imprisoned within her own failing flesh. Her authority, once unquestioned, proved meaningless before the cold hand of mortality. The Queen, who had passed judgment in God's name, finally confronted the most human of all verdicts: helplessness. The haunting link between Mary's personal suffering and her public cruelty gives rise to the disturbing paradox that defines her legacy. She was both executioner and victim. The pain she carried within herself transformed into a compulsion to inflict pain upon others. In this sense, Mary Tudor is not merely a historical figure. but a living embodiment of how trauma and faith can merge to create monstrosity. In the end, Mary Tudor's blackened, decaying body bore not only the marks of disease, but also the price of fanaticism. The Queen, who sought to purify England's soul with fire, ultimately lost her own within it. What she left behind was neither triumph nor salvation, only a warning. Soaked into the scent of her own dissolving flesh, when faith becomes devoid of mercy, it ceases to serve God and becomes the handmaiden of decay.